So with that, let me introduce myself briefly and the speakers. So as I said, I'm Christopher Mazzio at Direct REL Northwest. For those of you not familiar with the REL system, there are 10 RELs around the country, and we provide support to educators in our regions on using data and evidence. Our region in the Northwest covers 5 states: Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. Our speakers today are folks who are working really at the cutting edge of this topic of mindsets, focused on mathematics, and we have 3 folks who are going to speak, and I'm going to introduce them all at the front end, and then they're going to each kind of take a piece of the webinar and introduce their colleagues as they go through. So we're going to start with Rachel Beatty, who is at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Rachel currently directs the Productive Persistence program there. We also have 2 practitioners from 2-year community colleges, Michelle Brock, who's a faculty member in mathematics at American River College in Sacramento, and Paul Verschueren, sorry Paul if I got that wrong.
You nailed it.
Okay, excellent. Should have went for the phonetic spelling. At a math faculty member at Seattle Central College in Seattle, Washington, in our region. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, who's going to lead us through the first part of the webinar.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So welcome to the webinar. Oh, I see, yep, from our participants. I'm so excited to be here and share the work that we're doing at the Carnegie Foundation. Just so you have a roadmap of what we're doing during this hour, here are our objectives. First, I'm going to start with some research on the root causes of low academic success, particularly in developmental mathematics, just to give you a background about why we developed the Productive Persistence Framework. Then I'll talk briefly about the overall framework of productive persistence, and then we'll drill down to one component, that is growth mindset. And then Paul and Michelle will share real practical strategies they use in their classrooms to promote and sustain a growth mindset. So with that, I'll dive right into the reason why we developed this framework in the first place. And at the Carnegie Foundation, we believe in being problem-focused and user-centered. So I'm going to just describe a little bit of the problem we started off with in 2009. And that is the problem in developmental mathematics. So what we see is 60 to 70% of entering community college students need at least one developmental math course before enrolling in college credit courses. However, if you look at the data, 80% of those students never get out of that developmental math pathway, resulting in about 500,000 students in every cohort where math becomes a gatekeeper and not a gateway. And so in 2009, we partnered with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, the Carnegie Corp, and the Lumina Foundation to take a different approach, because we know that if we keep using the same approach, we shouldn't expect different results. And so what we created was an innovative, transformative strategy in undergraduate mathematics education called the Community College Pathways Program. And this involved more than just a shift in curriculum. It involved a shift in pedagogy. It did involve a shift in curriculum using real-life problems and allowing students to productively struggle and engage in deliberate practice. And it also included a focus on students' non-cognitive aspects, or what we call productive persistence. And compared to traditional success in achieving college credit courses for students in developmental mathematics, in which 6% of those students get credit after 1 year and 15% get credit after 2 years. And as we saw on the previous slide, 20% get credit after 3 years. Statway gets 51% of our students get college credit in mathematics after 1 year. So essentially tripling the success rate in half the time. And so now I'm going to focus on one component of our successful program, which is what we call productive persistence. And it is very alliterative, but it is purposeful why we named it that. And it's because of some stereotypes we see around community college students and college students in general. And one being is that they are not persistent. However, in our survey results, we found that these students were actually quite persistent. So of the 1,000 students placed into elementary algebra, our Statway program in 2010, we saw 50% started college over 3 years ago, 20% started college over 5 years ago, 8% started college over 10 years ago, and a 2.5% started college 20 years ago or more. So it's not that they weren't persistent, they're just unproductively persistent. And so our goal for our students was to help them work harder and work smarter. Now there's a little bit of a danger here once we give something a name. So whether it be productive persistence, mindsets, grit, the impulse is to grab the closest solution because you do want to help your students. And this is so common we came up with a name for it. We call it solutionitis. So it's a search for the perfect widget. And you may hear people come up to you and go, oh, you want to work on mindset? Well, you should try and peer tutors to help students feel like they belong and give them study skills and try intrusive advising. But don't forget metacognitive monitoring of progress. And you need to help them navigate the college campus. But don't forget mandatory orientation. And proper placement is essential. And we also need wraparound support and supplemental instruction to make sure our students understand what they're learning, and we need student cohorts to have them feel like they belong. We should invest in faculty development and have academic counseling. And then don't forget self-regulated learning to help their independent study habits. We also need career planning, acceleration, and a sense of self-efficacy. And before you know it, you have all of these things thrown at you. And it's not that any of these things are inherently bad. In fact, many of these suggestions are essential. However, it's coming from the wrong point of view. It's coming from an outsider's point of view, layering on things on a broken system. Instead, we want to take a different view, the view of our user. What's actually going on in the classroom? What's it like from a faculty member's perspective, a student's perspective? And that's where we started at when we created our productive persistence framework. We actually went out and interviewed faculty members. We interviewed students. We saw what the system was like. And when we interviewed students, we got things like this. A student, upon completing a diagnostic assessment in a developmental math course, said, I'm embarrassed by how stupid I am and suddenly feeling very discouraged. I can't even tell which fraction is bigger than another or where they should fall on the number line. I feel like crying. And so many of the students echoed this sentiment, that they just could never do mathematics. And just they didn't think it was possible that they were, math people or not. And so we wanted to work on this. And we started to look for ideas. And when we originally started searching, the field didn't agree on success. And many of the bigger programs didn't show long-term effects. However, there were sources of promising ideas in two places. The first was in research and psychology, in which we were finding brief and inexpensive interventions that had large and enduring effects in the K-12 setting and in four-year universities. For example, Lisa Blackwell conducted an 8-session workshop on how the brain grows with effort, and this increased low-income middle school students' math GPA months later. Jeremy Jameson did a 30-minute writing exercise that reduced math anxiety on tests for up to 2 months later for four-year university students. And then a 1-session intervention where four-year college students wrote essays conducted by Walton and Cohen in 2011 reduced racial achievement gap by 50% up to 4 years later, and these essays were about belonging. And so these were really promising, inexpensive ideas. However, they're either for the K-12 setting or for the four-year college setting, but not for community colleges. And so we turned to our other source of ideas, and that were our practitioners. Because they bring that lens of expertise. They understand their classroom and their students. However, they're often siloed and unable to share their ideas widely and unable to test them widely. And so in order to develop and translate these ideas to our setting, we needed to form a network of researchers and practitioners. And that's what we did. And this network was guided by 6 principles. And we call these the 6 core principles of improvement. And the first I've already touched on is that we need to be problem-focused and user-centered. We need to understand who our users are. We need to empathize with them. And we really need to hone in on a specific problem to practice. And the second is attending the variability. It isn't good enough to understand what works, but we need to understand what works for whom and under what conditions. Context is incredibly important. And in order to make change in a variety of settings, we need to understand how this would work in a variety of settings with a variety of practitioners. Next, we need to see the system. We're not teaching our students in a vacuum. We need to understand all of the different aspects that come to play when we're trying to increase our students' productive persistence. And then we also need to embrace measurement. We can't improve what we can't measure. If we can't measure it, we don't know if we're making substantial movement. And these include things like attendance, homework completion, how grades are working. So it's not all about outcomes. It's about the process as well. We also need to learn through disciplined inquiry. And this helps us document the changes that are being made to truly understand what effects we're having on our classroom. And last but not least, we organize as networks. And in these network improvement communities, we're able to accelerate our learning and truly understand what works for whom and under what conditions. So by uniting our network of researchers and practitioners and using these 6 core principles, we developed the Productive Persistence Framework. And so our general aim in productive persistence is that students need to continue to put forth effort during challenges, and when they do so, they use effective strategies. And with our network, we developed 5 high leverage factors that we believe, if we got movement on, would increase students' productive persistence. Now, these factors are not exhaustive. There are other things that contribute to students' productive persistence, but this is practically what we focus on in our classroom. Now, the first and the focus of this webinar is that students believe that they are capable of learning, so that it's even possible for them to learn. And that with effort, good strategies, and help seeking, they can achieve their academic goals. Another driver is that students need to feel socially tied to peers, faculty, and the course. And what we see is that students who question whether they belong are feeling belonging uncertainty. We see that they're likely to withdraw their effort and not do as well in the course. Students also need to believe that the course has value. And this is both in the short term and the long term, so relevance and purpose. We also want students to have skills, habits, and the know-how to succeed in college settings. This is especially important in terms of know-how for non-continuing gen students like myself who had no idea about how to navigate a college campus. For example, I thought they misspelled registrar and they meant to spell register. There's just many things that these students don't really know about college. And that's in addition to metacognitive study strategies, cognitive strategies, and emotional regulation strategies all fit into that yellow box. And last but not least, one of the reasons why we're having this webinar is that we want faculty and colleges to support students' skills and mindsets. So when we created this, what we call a driver diagram or productive persistence framework, we weren't satisfied that it just resonated with our faculty, resonated with our researchers. We wanted to see if these drivers actually predicted outcomes. And so that's what we did. We gave our students a survey in the first week of class measuring these productive persistence factors. And in our data set, measured them or labeled them as either high risk or low risk. So high risk would be that they didn't feel like they could succeed, they're very anxious, and they're questioning whether they belonged and felt like they were being, they had a high level of stereotype threat. And low risk would be the opposite. And what we see is that students who come in with those high risk productive persistence, that is, those beliefs I mentioned earlier, are more likely to be below the median on the baseline math knowledge test. Interestingly, 4 months later at the mid-course assessment, we see that gap between low risk and high risk still exists, such that students who are marked as high risk based on productive persistence have a higher percentage of those students fail the mid-course assessment. Interestingly, 10 months later, which is the last 2 columns there, there's a wider gap between low risk and high risk students in terms of failing the end of course assessment and their overall course success. And the theory is that if students don't feel like they can learn and they don't feel like they belong, then they're not going to invest the effort in the class. And they're going to slowly start this cycle of disinvestment, which will gradually get bigger, causing them to withdraw from the class and withdraw their effort. This is all sounds kind of scary and deterministic, so I want to follow immediately with that these beliefs can be changed. And that's the work that we've been doing with our faculty. And Michelle and Paul will touch on some of these routines as we go through the webinar. But in our Starting Strong package, we have 10 activities and routines that can practically shift students' mindsets. And what we see in the first month is an increase in their interest in mathematics. We also see they're more confident about their ability to succeed in math. They perceive that math is more relevant to their lives. And we also see a big drop in the belief that math intelligence is fixed. And we also see a drop in math anxiety and stereotype threat. And again, this is all in the first month of our class. So let's dive in and see how we can help students adopt the belief that they can learn, that it's possible for them to learn. Great. So just a reminder of our framework there. Now we're going to dive into the orange box, that students believe they're capable of learning. So part of our survey that I mentioned earlier is asking our students this question. Being a math person or not is something about you that you really can't change. Some people are good at math and other people aren't. And on the first week of class, 2/3 of our students agreed with this statement, believing that their math people are not math people and that no amount of effort, strategies, or help could help them be good at math. And so we knew this was a priority and we sought to change this. And so we looked at research about mindsets about ability done by Carol Dweck and colleagues over the years. And for those of you not familiar, a fixed mindset is a belief that intelligence is fixed, that if you have to try hard, you're clearly not smart, and that there's no point in trying if you're not a natural. So the goal for someone with a fixed mindset is to look smart. And to them, smart is effortless, natural, and easy. If their student thinks they're dumb and they do well, they attribute it to luck. For example, I had a student in my statistics class who got a B, and she said, oh, I only got a B because I'm lucky. And I said that was statistically unlikely that that was the reason why. Sadly, she did not think that was funny. But the point stands that even if you get evidence that you can learn and you can do well, students who are currently in a fixed mindset may reject it and go back to their belief that their intelligence is fixed. On the other hand, there's this belief that intelligence is malleable, that trying harder makes you smarter, and that obstacles can be overcome through effort, help from others, and use of improved strategies. And so it's important to note there, it's not just the quantity of time you spend, but it's the quality of time. So you want to use an effective strategy and be willing to switch your strategy if needed and learn from failure. And so many people don't really understand who have a fixed mindset what goes into having a growth mindset. They're being successful. So the process of learning, that you need to put in this effort and be strategic and work hard and work smart. And then clearly Calvin does not understand that either. So what are some strategies we see in the classroom that relate to growth mindset? So in the pathways, we have seen a couple study strategies. This one is called the bare minimum self-testing study strategy. It's actually a not very effective study strategy. This is a study strategy where students sometimes log in and only try the mandatory quizzes without reading the text or answering practice questions. Even controlling for math background knowledge, this study strategy negatively predicts semester end grades. For students who have a growth mindset, they would be more likely to engage in those optional activities and to try new strategies and challenge themselves. We also see that students who give up after failure are more likely to have lower end of the semester grades than those who try again after failure. Again, trying again after failure and trying to improve your strategy are very consistent with a growth mindset. So how do we actually shift our students' beliefs from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset? Well, one thing we do is we teach them about the brain. Not this brain, this is actually my brain from my years of being in neuroscience. And we teach them about brains in general and how neurons transfer information to one another. And that when you learn new things, you either make new connections or you strengthen existing ones. And so your experience actually shapes a lot of your knowledge. You're not born knowing logarithms, you're gaining that experience. And to help this shift, we adapted an article written by Lisa Blackwell and others in which they actually do learn about these facts. And so here's an excerpt that most people don't know, that when they practice and learn new things, parts of their brain change and get larger, a lot like muscles do. This is true even for adults. So it's not true that some people are stuck being not smart or not math people. You can improve your abilities a lot as long as you practice and use good strategies. So our students read this article, they write a summary, and then we have them relate what they learned in the article to an experience outside of mathematics. So one where they did develop a skill. Many of our students talk about learning how to drive or learning how to play a new sport. Then they have them write a letter to a friend discussing what they learned in the article. And to close out this task, we have students engage in a rich, challenging problem. And this is really important because it helps provide them evidence that they can learn with effort, good strategies, and help seeking when needed. So compared to an article that just had facts about the brain, we saw a 51% decrease in withdrawal rates for students in developmental mathematics. And this was done in collaboration with PERT. Since then, we've actually seen similar findings in other areas. So this is a recent study with Foothill College. We've noticed that those randomly assigned to the growth mindset article group were significantly less likely to have a failing grade at the end of pre-calculus. And what we noticed in our hierarchical linear models is that regardless of students' beliefs about themselves as learners at the beginning of the term, a positive change in growth mindset, so at the 4th week, is related to course success. And this is even after controlling for demographics and math background knowledge. And then I'll end with the most compelling evidence of all, something that our student wrote to us, one of our students wrote to us. So this student says, I feel very confident because I dedicated my time to learning concepts thoroughly. I feel that if a person puts in the work to really understand the concepts, they can pass. I was never a math person, but coming into Statway has completely changed how I feel about math. It's great. And so this student is talking here about, they know the process, they understand how they can learn, and that they feel confident that they can go and learn from here. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Paul Verschueren to talk about how he creates a classroom culture that supports a growth mindset at Seattle Central College. So take it away, Paul.
Okay, just quick mic check. Am I coming across? Rachel?
I hear you loud and clear.
Okay, my mic kicked out earlier, everybody, so I was wanting to be sure. We have had a real gift to be part of the Statway program at Seattle Central since the beginning, which we didn't necessarily know was at the forefront of looking at mindset and productive persistence. But it's been a gift, not just to my Statway classes, but more and more to my other classes as well, as I learn to transfer outside the class. And that's what I'm going to try to do today, is not just talk about Statway or this one particular classroom, talk about the general applications, and Michelle's going to chime in and help as well. So the question is, how can you create a classroom culture that supports a growth mindset? And the first thing I would say is that it starts right at the start. From day one, I have a blurb in my syllabus that reads, most students in this class will have struggled with mathematics at some point in their life. It may have been an experience that really affected your confidence. Please understand that you are now at a new phase in your life and will be able to see the material in a new light. You will likely have more mathematical ability than you had thought. Know that with the right strategies and support, you can succeed in this class. Once you have, think, if I can do this, what else can I do? I write that in there because I really want them to know right out of the gate that we are here to learn math, and I don't expect them to be easy. So it's not going to be a review. Sometimes in developmental math, I notice that people say, you should know this, or this is review, which I think is a really hard thing for students to hear, especially if it doesn't come across to them like review or like something they already know. Rachel showed you the article that we share right in the beginning about growth mindset and some of the brain science that supports it. That's kind of the first piece of advice I'd give in the beginning, is to let them in on it and to be explicit, and not have it be something that you're subtly doing in the undercurrent, but something you're really communicating directly about, sharing the studies. So really making sure they understand the language. Opportunities will come up later to identify when students are stuck in a fixed mindset, or when they're exercising a growth mindset, and when they're struggling well, moments like that in the future. It's the more explicit and the more in on it that the students are, the more that they can see it happening within themselves and start to self-identify. I particularly as well have some very strong opinions about mathematics education in this country. I think that I've had many students in the past that are very good at procedures and able to follow the steps and arrive to the correct answer, but in no way does that necessarily mean that they're deeply struggling with and understanding the mathematical concepts that are embedded in the problem solving. And I've also had students that struggled very much and didn't necessarily just start plugging numbers into a formula without being convinced that it made sense or there was a reason for it. I share that with my students because I think it's good for them to hear that the education that maybe they were in, or the teachers that they had, including myself, are not necessarily perfect, and we are continuing to learn. And education is changing, and the approaches are changing, and there's the opportunity for them to learn with a new approach. And I like to make it very clear that this is a new approach and a new opportunity, and one that they can be successful in. Probably the biggest gift that I've gotten from looking at growth mindset and working with Carnegie in the last 4 years is something that a group called the Framework for Improvement of Teaching developed, which really gives some clues as to how exactly you can talk about mathematical thinking, celebrate mathematical thinking, without necessarily pointing to the exact correct method or the correct way. And that's actually a very tricky thing, that when students are sharing thinking that's either flawed or not necessarily as advanced as you're going to need to see from them in the near future, it's sometimes hard to figure out exactly what you should say. And I'm going to walk you through a problem-solving technique that involves students being given open-ended, rich problems that have multiple approaches, and how to discuss with your classroom what happened or the results of that process, without necessarily celebrating in any one way or shooting down any methods, but that also leads the class in the right direction in the end. As a teacher, our main role is to observe and to keep track of the problem-solving approaches. What that looks like is walking around and paying attention and taking note of what groups are solving the problem by what method. And in the back of your mind, kind of ordering a discussion by what you see. And I'm about to show you exactly what I mean by all that. Right here, this problem is asked that, this is in a module about correlation. It says, for a female with a forearm of 10 inches, based on the data set, what would you predict her height to be? And I think I'm just going to give you about 20 seconds just to look at it so you can absorb that on your own and think about what the answer to that question would be. So typically, students or groups of students will look at this problem in one of 4 approaches. They might use a one-point solution, and some of you listening may have also used any of these 4 approaches to solve. A one-point solution would involve a student potentially looking and noticing immediately that if you look at a 10-inch forearm, there is no data that gives heights corresponding to someone who had a 10-inch forearm, but then you might see that there's some data points that are close. So a student might choose one of them. I believe the one I'm pointing to now is probably the closest. So a student might say, well, the closest piece of data we have looks like that person is about 62 inches tall. Or they might even say, but it looks like the next one after that is a little taller, so maybe I'll consider it up a little bit and say maybe 63 inches tall. If I were to go over this problem in class, if someone used that approach, I would first call on that group to share that approach. Listen to what they said, talk about the advantages of it, quite quick, find the closest point, and then we could either at that point talk about the potential cons of that method then, or maybe we could save that till after we've seen some other methods. So if I had gone around and I had seen someone use a 2-point method where maybe they chose, well, here's 2 points, kind of notice maybe they should choose a high and a low and average out those 2 points. So perhaps they chose this point and this point as 2 data points close to 10-inch forearm and said, well, about halfway between those is, say, just over 65 inches tall. So perhaps they'll say 65 or 66 inches tall would be the prediction for the height of this particular person. That would be the 2-point solution. And then perhaps another group might even decide to use all 4 of the data points they have in order to mark, to average out 4 points surrounding 10-inch forearm and average it all out. And that also averages somewhere about 65 inches or so. And then last but not least, and this is the way that we're really leading them to, because in statistics, what we'll eventually do is use what's called a linear regression or a line of best fit that uses the data and kind of sees it as a band and a line that would somewhat centrally run through this data and be a good estimator for the prediction you're trying to make. An advantage to that is it wouldn't restrict just to the 10-inch forearm, but it would consider, even if you wrote that line, you could also predict for a 12-inch forearm or a 9-inch forearm or anything in between. So the last one is clearly the most sophisticated for several reasons. One, it considers all of the data, and another, it creates a tool that you can use not just to answer that singular problem, but to answer other problems as well. So I would, in advance, order the sharing from the groups in this exact order as you see, and along the way, the students would arrive to understanding see that one might be more sophisticated or have added sophistication over the last as you go without necessarily rejecting anyone's idea. The idea being that the growth mindset is essentially, could be a fragile place for students, and it might not necessarily remain intact if you spend your day shooting down ideas or training the students that they eventually will get to the right answer and it's no longer necessary for them to struggle and come up with potentially, quote, incorrect answers when all along the teacher's just going to share the right answer in the end anyway. So changing our own mindsets is an important part of this. It does take some rethinking of what maybe we've done in the past. But for students, there's really no better way to convince them to change their own mindsets if you're not changing your own. In my own classroom, I talk about examples from my own life where I've changed my mindset or things that I've noticed or assumptions I've made about myself that I found to be incorrect since learning about this stuff. But moreover, in our own classroom, I like to talk about how that I can change, this class can change. I accept feedback. I'm willing to make alterations to the class and the calendar based on what they see, and that I'm not stuck in my own way and I'm not perfect, and that I can also change and struggle and modify with something new. I'm about to pass the mic to my colleague Michelle Brock in Sacramento, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the language and sort of the day-to-day of growth mindset. Thank you all very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Paul. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Fantastic. So I'm going to talk to you about promoting the growth mindset with everyday phrases. So what exactly is that? That's the phrasing that we use when we speak to our students that encourages the growth mindset. So it can be something as simple as tacking on a little word, which I'll talk about in a minute, when students are struggling with their learning. But it's just about setting the environment and making sure that the environment in all areas are set where growth mindset is being promoted as we go through. The learning environment consists of, our in-class daily contact when we have the students actually in our presence and they're working and they're struggling, and listening to them and hearing the kinds of conversations that they're having or the words that they're using to figure out where the students are at, and trying to help encourage them or to provide comments to them that can help get them onto the right track with their thinking. It can also be done, phrasing can also be done in emails if we need to reach out to students, that we can encourage them through emails that with words that can support the growth mindset. And also as we encounter critical moments during their learning process. When we think about this, there can be different moments in the learning process, and I want to define that first for you as the sustained effort, that they're actually keeping up their energy and efforts towards completing the tasks that they're working on, that they're using good strategies, that if they find that a strategy isn't working, that they're stepping back and trying something different, and that they're seeking help. So critical moments can occur in their learning, can be maybe when the students need encouragement because they're finding that they're struggling and they don't feel like they can overcome it. So we need to have a way that we can engage with them that can help get them over that and allow them to continue to sustain. Also, maybe when they are doing something well, we want to make sure that the words that we use are supporting that and not going back to supporting them being smart, that their knowledge is fixed, that we make sure that how we can communicate with them keeps that part open. And so why would we do this? Well, because we do in the Statway program, we do the initial intervention where we have the students read the mindset article at the beginning. We find that students do have a shift in their belief about their potential to learn, but that happens in the first week. And we find that when we have our students for 16 weeks, or in the case of us with Statway for 32 weeks, that one-time intervention at the beginning isn't quite enough to keep them on the right track. So we want to make sure that we're supporting that work and keeping that kind of in the forefront for students. And as Paul said, letting them in on it. Like, we've let them in on the secret already, now let's keep that as part of our story. It does promote the classroom culture. I do believe that students, and it's the belief that I set up in my classroom, that students who are struggling are the ones who are going to get the most amount of learning that happens. It means that they're really working at it and it's going to happen. We just want to make sure that the struggle that they're encountering is going to be productive and will help them get to where they need to be. We have to be thoughtful about how we praise and encourage student learning. Probably up until I started with the Statway program, there were many things that I would say that I thought were encouraging students, and I realized after all of this work that all of my good intentions maybe weren't doing the best things to support the student learning, which leads to this, that the best intentions are not always productive. So one of the studies that was done with the Khan Academy and PERT, it was a study that was done in a fractions model with Khan Academy. And the control group, the students were working through a fractions model, and the control group were given a generic phrase that did not include growth, just talking about what they're doing. Just, if you don't succeed, just try again, just keep going for it. And then the experimental group were given a growth mindset phrase. So when you learn a new kind of math problem, you grow your math brain. What they found was that the improvement in these students was with their growth mindset phrases, we're getting a 4 to 5% increase in learning rates. So this is consistent with what with what we're trying to find out and what we've been working on in Statway. So what can we do with the everyday phrases? When can we use it? Well, after success. One of the phrases that we can use, or that I do, you're improving, your efforts are really paying off. This is also a good opportunity to speak to the students' strategies that they're using that they're finding to be successful, or to get them to identify what they're doing to be successful, so that they see that it's not just luck that's getting them there or something that was already in them, but that they're actually putting forth the effort and it's producing something. Instead of saying, hey, you're really good at that. Another opportunity is after they get critical feedback. Now, the students aren't immune to the fact that, or it's not new to them to get feedback that tells them that they haven't quite got something yet. So it's really important that we can couch it in such a way that it encourages them to keep working at it and to try different things. So this class has a high standard, a standard of deeply understanding the math, but I wouldn't hold you to it if I didn't believe that together we could get there. I say that often in my class, and it just to remind them that while they might feel like they're being picked on if I'm giving them critical feedback, I want to remind them that that's not the case, that it's about encouraging them to get there because I know that they can, that I know that with our together we can get there. Instead of saying, keep trying and you'll get it. Encouragement after difficulty. You got a low score. How can you learn from this to get better? Or that feeling of math being hard is a feeling of your brain growing. So as they struggle through it, understanding that they are growing, that something good is going to come from it. Instead of saying, oh, don't worry about it, you'll do better next time. Now with this difficulty piece, what it leads to is one of the interventions that we have been working on is test corrections. Now this is part of that self-regulated learning, getting the students involved in understanding where their misconceptions are. So we want to make sure that if they're missing something, they aren't just glossing over and saying, oh, forget about it, I just won't ever get it, but to get a chance to really understand. So what we do, how we go about this, is to have the student identify the mistake or the misconception that was made, and then they have to go through and show a correctly solved problem. Now, what happens if the student doesn't know the mistake, if they don't understand what they did to get there? Well, this is where they can seek help. They can engage with the professor, they can engage with the tutor, another student in the class. There's ways to go about to get this information and to be able to pull this together. So they need to be able to identify the mistake, and then they're going to show how to work it correctly. And different ways, different teachers handle this differently. I've personally have used it in my class as complete for correction only, so that we're looking at that, and I would go back and review their work and provide secondary comment to them. Other teachers, Paul, does redemption points and allows them to earn back points on exams, and I'm considering that for myself for future. I will pass it back to you, Rachel.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul and Michelle, for sharing what you do in your classroom. And I just wanted to wrap up this section saying that now you have many good practical ideas to start with. However, you will need to do some work in translating those to your settings. So I do recommend considering these, again, 6 core principles of improvement as you work to adapt these practical strategies for your classroom and for your school. And particularly the organizing as networks, because that's really how we truly accelerate our learning. Because we know we can accomplish more together than even the best of us can do alone. And so with that, I think we're going to take some questions.
So we have a few questions that have come through the WebEx, and folks, I encourage you to continue to send questions if you have them. We have about 15 minutes, or 14 minutes. So Rachel, the first question is actually for you, I have, and it's about, someone asked how growth mindset and productive persistence is different than the notion of like self-efficacy or sense of self.
Sure. So that's a really good question. The big distinction there, if we use self-efficacy as defined by Albert Bandura, is that that's kind of your confidence or judgment of your ability to meet a goal. And that can definitely be related to your mindset. But a growth mindset is more believing in the process of learning, so knowing how to learn and emphasizing the process that involves effort, good strategies, and help. And it could be that the outcome of a growth mindset is increased self-efficacy. But it could be that someone with a fixed mindset has a good sense of self-efficacy. That means that they believe the task is easy, that it's not challenging, and that they're smart, and that they can accomplish it. And that means they would have a good sense of self-efficacy. And so that would be the primary distinction, if that makes it clear.
Thanks, Rachel. Paul, the next question we have is for you, and it was just more, and this is probably something that both you and Michelle can maybe both talk about. There was a question about just sort of what advice would you give to either colleges or schools that are interested in kind of doing and testing these kinds of interventions, and if you could also, as a sort of a secondary question, you know, as you work with, as you think about other faculty members and other teachers, what challenges have folks faced in kind of doing this kind of work?
Well, first of all, I'd say if it's possible, I remember at Seattle Central, we actually had, you know, when the staff met before the school year started all together, we had a speaker come just to speak about this, and actually gave a very similar presentation to Rachel's, and had a follow-up session where people could bounce off ideas that they have or share phrases that they use and sort of put it through the gauntlet as to whether that was a mindset phrase or not a mindset phrase. It's pretty funny, actually, because this guy essentially found something that was a little off as far as growth mindset in nearly everything that anyone brought up, including my own. Which I think also highlights the difficulty, is that this is not right away. It takes a while to start catching yourself, and especially with the language, changing your language. Another option, if a large scale thing like that, is just to get a group together to start discussing it and meeting it, and making goals and trying to pilot some growth mindset ideas, maybe even collect some data. Little things that I just will never stop doing is follow-up emails to students with my language being more warm and informative, as opposed to I can fall into just, oh, they blew off class, they're a slacker. Just basically trying to approach students with the most, I guess it's really just care and warmth as I can. Michelle, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that it's important to remember that we use language in our classroom that, like I said, up until the time that I started working with the productive persistence group, was using language that I thought was good and helpful and supportive, to find out, just like what Paul was saying, like little pieces can be picked out as not really supporting a growth mindset, and it takes a lot to kind of retrain our brains to be careful of the things that we're saying, and to be mindful so that it can become something a little bit more automatic. And yes, it's watching how we're engaging with the students in the emails when we see that they're missing, or if they're missing homeworks, or if they're missing assignments and things like that, to understand that there's probably bigger things going on than what I might have initially thought, maybe even 10 years ago, that, oh, they just don't care enough to do it. that there's other things in it, and some of it could even boil down to the fact that they don't necessarily believe that they can do it. And so finding the right ways to encourage them to get them there, and working with a group, getting a team of faculty to work with at your campus or nearby would be extremely helpful.
Great, thanks. So we have kind of a related question, which I think any of the three of you probably could weigh in on. And it's sort of that issue of about, was there any kind of, do faculty members or teachers who kind of do this work, do they have any sort of initial negative reactions to kind of having to teach about mindsets as opposed to teaching directly about math? Or do you have sort of issues where you kind of have to change faculty or teacher sensibilities around growth before they can kind of do this work with students? So that's really to any of the three of you.
Hey, Paul and Michelle, why don't I let you talk about your experiences, and then I'll speak for the larger network.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I default a little bit to you on that because you probably have more experience with actually seeing an implementation in schools. My first reaction is if the teacher doesn't believe it, having them read an article and just kind of rush through an article because their department requires it or something is probably not going to have too much an effect. It probably would, well, anyway, I don't want to, Rachel might have more data on that than I know, but I think that there would have to be some buy-in. And yeah, I think I'll default to Rachel's experience on this one.
Yeah, well, I kind of feel like I was a choir that got preached to on this one. So I've always believed that the student learning it, that whether or not a student could do well in math had something to do with their confidence or their belief of whether or not they could learn it. And I think that starting with a group of people, you understand when you start, when you listen to the people that you talk to, whether or not they're ready to be on board with something like this. I think that Rachel is probably a better person to answer this overall, though.
Sure, I just want to give you guys a shot. So yeah, we do see some resistance. It does help that the article takes about 30 to 40 minutes, and it's a one-time thing. And so that commitment seems lighter than other interventions. For example, the original was an 8-week workshop. And so by comparison, it's a much more practical lift. That being said, we do get some people who don't immediately see the value in it, and that's usually, as Michelle and Paul were touching on, is just kind of when you've had a brief introduction. But when we're able to really dig into the concepts, and we've been doing a lot of professional development opportunities with our community college pathways in terms of watching classroom videos, hands-on workshops, seeing more responses from the students in which the students are emphasizing the process of learning, I think those are ways to help change faculty's mindsets. Another way is through data. And we actually give our faculty members reports on productive persistence aggregated at the classroom level, and to see how their students' mindsets have changed from week 1 to week 4. And having this data, this actionable data available to them in real time has also helped to shift some of our faculty's mindsets.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Thanks all of you. We have time. We have a couple more questions, so we're not going to be able to get to everyone's questions, but we will be able to send some of the specifics that we don't get to the speakers, and they may be able to respond directly. So the next question, perhaps Rachel, but if any of you want to chime in as well. Well, there was a question about whether there are kind of differences in how effective these interventions are, or how students respond based on any sort of student characteristics, whether it's race, ethnicity, socioeconomic, prior kind of academic background or achievement. Do you have anything you can share about that?
I don't have the analyses off the top of my head, but I know in other studies they've seen these type of interventions are more effective for students in underrepresented groups. In our sample, we see that students who enter in with a lower math conceptual knowledge do have more of a fixed mindset than students with a growth mindset. And, this ability does, their incoming math knowledge does kind of temper their mindset a little bit. I'd have to go look up some numbers before I give any more results, but those are just some things off the top of my head that do affect response to the intervention.
Great. So another question that's come in is about issues with I'm sorry, I'm reading as I'm processing things. So there's a question here about sort of how young students can be where these interventions are successful. So you're dealing with community college students, so you're dealing with young adults, and there are a lot of folks on the phone and who are logged on who are probably dealing with younger children in their classes. So is there a sense of, are these robust for students who are maybe younger than the students that you all have been working with?
Oh yeah, definitely. This, the original Growth Mindset article is actually developed for middle schoolers, and we in our student agency improvement community, of which several members are on the webinar today, so hi guys, have been working to adapt these routines for essentially grades 5 through 12 in a variety of places across the country. Under 5th grade, I'm actually not familiar with any interventions for that age group, but I wouldn't discount it just because I'm not aware of their existence yet.
Great. And so I think the last question we have time for is for Michelle, and this is a question about the specific phrases. And so have you had experience with certain sort of phrases that just didn't work, or you thought would work but weren't as good at sort of promoting mindset? Has there been some trial and error on that, and have you learned anything in the process as you've kind of done these strategies?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I really try to forget the ones that don't work and focus on the ones that do. So I have really good amnesia when it comes to that. But just being careful that I'm focusing with the students when I talk about their learning, that I'm talking about what their effort is doing, that the strategies that they're using, and being specific about what they're doing. Or even if I find that a student is, say, have had students who were struggling, say, with exam taking, and working with them to talk about the strategies that they're using to study and prepare, and getting them to talk and open up and be open to the idea that they could shift up their energy into different ways to do different things, and to not focus on trying to make huge leaps in small amounts of times, but to just work on improving, that everything that they're doing from day to day is about improving from where they once were. And so I always focus on, with the students, and they start to giggle after a while, and they say, okay, yeah, we don't get it yet. So I always have them, I'm not understanding this, and the student will say, I'm not understanding this, and then I'll throw out yet. So, you can kind of make a little bit of there's ways to lighten it up for the classroom so that they can kind of lighten up their mood a little bit, because they get frustrated. And especially at the community college level, these students have been dealing with math frustration for a very long time. And this is the last thing that these students need so that they can get on to the next level of their education. So trying to keep it as light for them during those times, to remind them that they can put forth the effort, they can learn this, and to get them thinking about times when they were successful, and just to keep that in mind as we go through. I hope that answers.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So everyone, we're out of time. So I would like to thank all the speakers. This is the kind of point, if you were in a face-to-face presentation, we'd all clap, but just we're going to thank them very much for a really productive and interesting and provocative set of presentations. And just in terms of next steps, all those who registered for the webinar will receive from us an email that will provide the slides, will provide access to a recording of the webinar. I know some of you had some technical difficulties, as always happens, so this may be a chance to kind of review parts or review the whole thing again. And we also have had some requests for resources and other materials that one or more of the presenters have talked about, and we'll try to pull some of that together for you and put that in the follow-up email, but we also may direct you to some of the speakers to get materials we do not have. And you will also soon be receiving a survey from REL Northwest, from our contractor who does this, asking for your feedback on the event. So we greatly appreciate if you fill that out. So thanks again to our 3 presenters, and we will sign off. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody.
Oh, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.